Do you ever feel like you lost your sojo and you just want a quick and easy project to get you back in the swing of things? I got these charm packs from my sister and I went to the store and picked up some of this webbing to make straps. And this is a really fun and easy free pattern from Moda using one charm pack, just a little bit of yardage for lining, and then you can either make your own fabric straps or you can make straps with the cotton, the canvas webbing, and that's what I'm going to use today. And so the first thing is you take all of your charm pack squares and you just cut them in half so that they end up being 2.5 inches by 5 inches, and you're just going to cut all of them in half. The next step is to take all of your 2.5 inch by 5 inch pieces and you're going to sew them together on the short ends. So you're basically making long, narrow strips, and you need it to be 8 pieces long. So if you do sets of 2 and then sew those sets of 2 into sets of 4 and then sew those sets of 4 into sets of 8. If you're working with a charm pack that has a lot of different prints in it, you don't have to be too careful about what you're doing here. I did just try to make sure I wasn't putting the same color next to each other. So if I was grabbing one with an aqua background, I tried to grab something with either navy or white background to go next to it. So I wasn't really too picky about which colors I was putting together, just that I wasn't putting the exact same prints next to each other. I'm just sewing with a 1/4 inch foot, and I'm just using like an ivory colored thread and my normal stitch length of 2.5. So once you've got sets of 2, you're going to sew the sets of 2 together to make sets of 4. And then just take your sets of 4 to make your sets of 8. So this goes really quickly and easily. And when I was putting together my strips of 8, I just tried to make sure that I didn't have too many of the same prints in the same one. It does wrap around to the other side of the tote bag, so it's going to be okay. But I tried to kind of keep the prints separate. You don't have to worry about nesting any seams. So when you're doing this, you can iron it whichever way you want to iron it. On half of your strips, you're going to cut a 2.5 inch piece off one end and add it down on the other end. This is because we want to make it like a brick pattern, and now it shows a way in the pattern that you can sew it like a loop and then cut the loop in half, but to my mind, it was easier just to trim off a little 2.5 inch square from one end and sew it to the other end of the strip. Okay, so I added that 2.5 inch piece on either end. So now it's 7 whole blocks and then 2 of the little half blocks, one on either end. And so you're gonna just lay your strips out 8 whole blocks and then 7 with the half on either end and alternate them until you finish out the whole charm pack. And this is what makes the majority of your bag. Now your strips are not going to be perfectly even on the ends because the one that has the little half blocks, it has an extra seam. So that's taking up an extra 1/2 inch. So the blocks that have the half blocks on the end are going to be 1/2 an inch shorter than your strips that are the 8-hole blocks. I started laying everything out in front of me because I did want to try to play around a little bit with color placement, especially on whatever was going to be the end of my strips, because the end of the strips ends up being near the top of your bag, near the handles. And so I knew that was going to be a very visible part of the bag. So I didn't want to have all navy or all aqua or all pink around the top of the bag. So I did start laying it out in front of me so I could kind of try to watch the color placement. Once you have your long strips laid out in a color pattern that you're happy with, you can start sewing your strips together. And it's going to go one of the ones that had the 7 blocks with a little half block on the end and a strip that has the 8 whole blocks. So that it kind of is staggered and makes a brick-like appearance. And again, your edges are not going to be perfectly even because the one that has the extra seam is 1/2 inch shorter. But you're just going to keep sewing these together until you make one big quilt unit for your tote bag. The pattern that I'm going to link says to only do 8 rows total, but I had enough from one charm pack to do 10 rows. So I went ahead and did 10. So I had to cut my lining a little bit bigger, but I just went with the bigger size. The next step is to use some type of stabilizer. I'm using fusible fleece. I am just using my strip unit here as my measuring guide. And I'm just cutting my fusible fleece down to the same size as this. And then I'm going to use it again to cut my lining down to the right size. You could skip this step. And in fact, the pattern I don't think tells you to add the fusible fleece, but it adds a nice sturdiness to your tote bag and it helps the sides kind of stand up. And it just looks, I feel like, a little bit more finished in the end. Now, one side of this fusible fleece has a rough, bumpy texture, and that's the side that has the glue. So you have to feel with your fingers and feel which side has the bumps, and you're going to put the wrong side of your strip set on the bumpy side of your fusible fleece, and then you can iron it together. And it has little tiny glue dots that kind of melt. And I'm still going to stitch this on, but I'm going to iron it first. I'm starting in the very center, and then I'm working my way out and down to try to smooth out any wrinkles. But I felt like starting in the center gave me my best chance of keeping it centered. Now, when you're working with a fusible, any type of interfacing, or in this case, this fusible fleece, you want to be careful that you don't put your iron anywhere that doesn't have fabric, because you can end up with glue on your iron if you're not careful. Next, I'm going to trim up my ends. My sides of my strip unit are pretty straight, but the ends are a little bit jagged. So I'm just going to trim this up very neatly, and then I'm going to cut my lining to be the exact same size as this strip unit. I switched my sewing machine over to its walking foot, and all I'm doing, I tried to do a stitch in the ditch, but it really ended up being a stitch near the ditch. But I'm basically just adding a few straight quilting lines. It is fused together on that fusible fleece, but adding a few lines of stitching is just going to help ensure that this tote bag doesn't disintegrate over time. It'll just help it hold together. And the stitches look kind of pretty. It just kind of finishes the bag nicely. I went to about the midpoint and then I started running out of throat space to keep it really flat. So I turned the whole unit around and did the last few rows from the other direction. This charm pack was called Regency Lawns, and it's all different little florals. And I think it has just some really adorable prints. This pattern was super simple. Once you have this part all quilted and ready to go, you just fold it right sides together and sew straight down the sides. And then we're gonna box those corners. But because it's just one long piece that you fold over, you don't have to add a bottom. It was just a very simple project. So if you're just looking for something to make in one afternoon, this would be the project. I did my first seam at 1/2 inch, and then I went back and added another seam that was a 1/4 inch. And with my walking foot, the 1/2 inch seam is really easy to do. But the 1/4 inch, what I did was I moved my needle position over so that I could keep using my walking foot to add just a reinforcing 1/4 inch seam. And I did that on both sides. The process is pretty much the same with the lining, except you need to leave a hole in one side of your lining so that you can turn your bag right side out after you add your lining. Wherever you want to leave your hole, make sure you backstitch around that hole just to reinforce it so those seams don't pop when you go to turn your bag right side out. Find your opening and make sure it's at the top. Then you're going to use a ruler and choose which size you want for your boxy corners. I believe the pattern says 2 inches, but I wanted mine to be a little bit deeper, so I went 2.5. And I'm just going to draw a 2.5 inch square on either corner. I'm just using a ballpoint pen because I'm going to cut this all off. Cut out your corners, and then you're going to pull it apart, line it up, and you're going to sew straight over that. And it's best to do it at least twice just for reinforcement. I had originally planned to use sort of a burnt orange coral color, but when I actually dug into this charm pack, I decided I actually liked the yellow better because there was a lot of yellow and navy. So, if you change your mind when you get into the project with what, you want to coordinate with it, it's perfectly fine. You will need to repeat the same process of measuring and boxing out your corners on your tote bag itself. After that, you just need to add your straps and your lining. And I unfortunately lost my recording of when I added my straps, but here we are. I am now pulling out the lining. This is the hole. This is what I turned my bag through earlier. And so I'm finding this hole and I need to stitch it shut. And then I'm gonna top stitch around the entire top of the bag to make sure to secure the layers together and to secure those straps in place. Once the hole in the lining is sewn shut, you can go ahead and push the whole thing back down into the bag. I'm going to put a link in the description to the free pattern. I think this was a really fun, fast sew, and it's nice that it only takes one charm pack plus a little bit of yardage. And then if you have some of that webbing, it makes really easy straps, or you can sew your own fabric straps. But I think this is a really fun pattern because if you have just one charm pack, it's not really enough for a full quilt, but a tote bag, it's definitely enough for that. I ended up doing 2 rows of top stitching. This was one of the simplest tote bags I've made, but I thought it was really cute and really fun. And if you just want a one-day project, this was a really good one.